Welcome everyone to Raise the Roof. Today we're going to start a 6-part series through James Sire's classic book, The Universe Next Door, a Basic Worldview Catalog. This episode features a conversation with my friend Monique Duson from the Center for Biblical Unity. I'll let Monique introduce the book and all the details, but before we dive in, don't forget to follow and rate the show on your favorite podcasting service, such as Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And remember, if you want to participate with me in a subscribers-only question and answer, you can sign up through my website, morethancake.org. So with that, I'll turn it over to Monique and let her get things started.
A couple weeks ago, I read an amazing book called The Universe Next Door by James Sire, and it is a worldview catalog. And so basically what this book does is go through the major worldviews, and it changed my way of thinking about worldview and about even my faith and how I understand my faith, how I answer certain questions related to my faith. So let's bring on Joe so we can get this conversation started, and I'll give you some more details. Thank you for joining me. I asked you to join me in conversations about worldview, and in reality, I'm going to be joining you because you know a lot more than I do about worldviews and how to present them. Joe has done an entire series on worldviews, and we released those, I believe, 17 videos leading up to. So in the month of September on our social media pages, we released all of his videos incrementally leading up to today's conversation. And so this conversation on worldview will happen over the next, I think it's 6 weeks, Joe?
Yeah, we have 6 weeks together. Yeah.
Over the next 6 weeks, where we are just looking at 2 worldviews a week, except for this week, we're going to do the introduction and Christianity as a worldview. So, Joe, for anybody who's unfamiliar, why don't you tell them about yourself?
Yeah, well, I've been on the show a few times over the years. We've been connected for about 3 years now. I think 2020 is when we got late 2019, something like that. Since then, a lot has changed in my life. I used to be in San Diego, teaching out there, involved with campus ministry. But last year, I moved here to Phoenix, Arizona. I took a job as assistant professor of Christian Worldview at Grand Canyon University. So I get to spend my semesters teaching about 300 students a semester across 4 different classes, all walks of life, every worldview you can imagine. You know, I got Buddhists and Wiccans and atheists and Christians all in my classes. We're interacting, talking about Christian worldview all the time. So that's sort of my life right now. During the school year, the summers I get off, I get to travel, I speak a few places, get around here and there. But yeah, that's the focus of where I'm at right now in terms of ministry. Where my apologetic side sort of comes out is in that classroom, all looking at Christian worldview.
Thank you. And thank you for joining me. I really appreciate it. So first of all, let's talk about our textbook itself. Why do you appreciate this book, The Universe Next Door by James Sire?
All right. Well, I'm going to tell you a secret that I have not told anybody before.
Okay.
That I'm going to divulge on your show. This is breaking news.
Okay.
I prior to this show, and you asked me to do this, I've never read the book. No. This is the classic that people always talk about. I spent so much of my life reading old dead people, and so I shaped my views on all these things, not reading a lot of contemporary stuff. I've just read old dead people for so long because they never disappoint you, right? Because once they're dead, they can't disappoint. So now that Sire has passed, I don't know when he did, but he's passed now, so I can read his book. So, but I'm excited because it's interesting how much of his framing on stuff is so similar to the way I frame things, the videos you guys sent out. But this book is a classic. It's been around. It's shame on me for never having really carved out the time to do it. This was my good excuse to do it. I teach Christian worldview. And I hadn't done this book. So, but it's really good. It's really well laid out. It just gives what is a worldview, what's the Christian worldview, and then compares it with others like Islam and naturalism, all kinds of different polytheistic views. Anything. It just covers all the bases of all the main ideas that we'll all deal with day to day with the people that we meet at the store or at our kids' schools or wherever we're at. So super helpful, very practical. It's been revised many times since, I believe, the 70s was the first version that came out, but I think it's the 5th revision or 6th that we have right now. And so it's just an excellent starting point for the concept of worldview.
Well, this is my very first book that I've ever read on like worldview specifically, like the catalog of different worldviews. And so maybe that's why I just feel like everyone needs to be knowing about worldviews and what is your worldview. So yeah, this was
good.
Maybe your last worldview book, but my All right. So jumping right in, why do you think the conversation of worldview is important?
It's important, as I talk about with students that every semester I have to convince them this class matters, right? Because at JCU, at Grand Canyon, they are required to take this class. They have no choice. And so I get the spectrum of Christians. Oh, I've heard it all. I don't need to know anything about God. I went to Christian high school. And then I get, of course, the students who are, atheist or, Buddhist or Wiccan. Like I've had Wiccan students in all my classes, in several of my classes. And they're like, well, I have to take it. I didn't even know I had to force to do this. You have to convince them it matters. So I tell them that there's a few reasons why I think it matters. One, we tend to live life isolated in our little buckets or silos, right? We surround ourselves with people we like. And after time, that sort of isolation, and we need it to some degree because we need people to affirm us, to tell us, hey, it's okay, and to give us encouragement because they see the world like we do. The problem is after time, we become isolated and our little buckets become, segregated to the point where when we see people with a different worldview, we become angry. And I think that's what we see a lot of the social media is that anybody who disagrees with me on anything, they're a reason they need to be canceled. I need to never talk to them. A politician says one thing I don't like, I can't vote for anybody. They're all bad. And so I think the idea is because we're not aware of our worldviews, we end up in isolation from one another. And so studying this hopefully helps us begin to engage with people, learn how to have conversations, and to also still love people who see the world through a different lens. And so that's one of the big reasons I'd throw out there. I mean, it's all our moral decision-making is shaped by worldview, that's for sure. It can give us purpose and meaning and satisfaction. It can help us if it tells us, hey, all your answers are inside, then you're going to look only to your heart to lead you, right? It can tell you to look outside, and then politics becomes our answer to all life's questions. Or it can tell us that we need to look towards God. And if that's the solution, which as Christians we believe is the right solution, then we end up with achieving, human flourishing, fulfilling our destiny, purpose with joy, satisfaction, peace, and contentment in the midst of life's chaos. So those are a lot of the reasons why I think it's so significant.
Well, that's awesome. For me, the conversation of worldview is important because not every worldview is believing in the one true God. Mm-hmm. And yet so much of other non-Christian worldviews are floating around in our culture, and we can unintentionally, unknowingly pick up pieces of those worldviews and then live our life from that place. So now we have this pluralistic type of Christianity, or this multi-layered Christianity where I have a little naturalism, I have a little, nihilism, I have some Gnosticism, I have some Christianity, but I'm calling myself a Christian, but approaching Christianity and the world actually from this multi-layered place where I'm actually believing in many different things. And so to me, when I read this book, what it actually did was it helped thread out for me places where I'm like, oh, you know what? I used to actually hold on to this or believe this. That is more this than Christianity. And so helping me realize that I called myself a Christian and I had all the best intentions and I love God and things like that, but my worldview didn't reflect Christianity entirely. And so how do we walk out a worldview that really reflects Christianity entirely? In looking at worldviews in this book really answers 8 major worldview questions. Do you think there's, I don't know, I found the 8 helpful. Do you think that there are any questions missing? And I will go through the questions in just a minute.
Yeah. So, the 8 that I think are in the book are excellent. I have no problem. It's just a matter of choice. It's dividing sometimes that same pie. How many slices do you get? 8 pieces or 6 pieces. I do 6 worldview questions. So anybody that watched mine, I look at 4 categories of, all worldviews answer those questions of origin, meaning, morality, and destiny. I think everything falls within those. And I boil that down to 6 worldview questions. How did I come into being? What's the purpose for my life? What's the right decision? What's the right thing to do at this point in my life? How will I be judged in the future? Where will I end up in the end? Right. So I think Sire's 8 are just as good. And so since he sells more books than I do, his are probably better. But I think they're really good. They're excellent. Of course, I haven't written a book on worldview, so maybe that's why I don't sell any. But that's neither here nor there.
I think you should. I think that could be a thing.
Yeah, I'm focused on all the videos right now.
And they're super helpful. But when Sire looks at worldview, he answers the questions 1 through 8 of what is a prime reality? Mm-hmm. So what's really real? What is the nature of external reality that is in the world around us? What is a human being? What happens to a person at death? Why is it possible to know anything at all? So what is knowledge? How do we get knowledge? Is it possible to have knowledge? How do we know what is right and wrong? What is the meaning of human history? Does human history have a meaning? And what personal life-orienting core commitments are consistent with this worldview? What do I need to do to be a good person? If if right and wrong exists, what do I need to do? How do I need to orient my life and commit my life to being a good person? So those are the questions that he answers in every chapter. We're not going to have the opportunity, because we're only here for an hour, to go through every question, but we will highlight some of the questions in each chapter and talk about that. The main question that we are going to answer at the end of every episode or live stream is, how is this worldview impacting, or why is this worldview important in the conversation of race? Because we're the Center for Biblical Unity and we talk about race, justice, and unity. How would you define a worldview?
So I love Sire's definition. I think it's good. It's a little too many words for what I would use, just because I used to have some very wordy and heady definitions. But I define worldview. It's the lens we use to interpret the world around us and make sense of all of our experiences, trying to answer those questions of origin, meaning, morality, and destiny. That's my simple framing for it. And it's sort of short, memorable, easy to understand, that we're trying to all make sense. We all have experiences. Some are good, some are bad. We all have suffering we've gone to. We've all had pleasure and joy and happiness. We all see stuff in our world that we're trying to make sense of. How do children starve in one place? Or what about human trafficking in this place? And what about Christians who've done bad stuff? Or Muslims who've done bad stuff? Or atheists we're trying to all make sense of the same experiences, largely speaking. And so that's the lens we use to shape it. I like that idea of lens. When we think of worldview as, lens in a glasses or a telescope or a microscope, it brings things into clarity, right? So a lens can distort something, or it can help us see it for what it truly is. And Sire brings up the idea that sometimes our worldview is unintentional or subconscious. We borrow it, like you were saying, from the culture. We pull ideas from different places. So I think about it like when you do that eye test at the doctor and he says, is this number, which is clear, number 1 or number 2? And he's got the little lenses he flips, and he flips through some and everything's all blurry. And everything's some that's like, oh, that's really clear, right? So think of worldview in that lens kind of way, where sometimes we add in a lens from over here, but it makes it worse because we're pulling from a worldview that's in conflict with our other worldview commitments. So we're trying to have this coherent, holistic approach, again, to those big questions of origin, meaning, morality, and destiny. And that's how I see worldview.
You're going to have to email that to us so I can make sure we can make a graphic and put that up there.
I'll make one in the future video.
Thanks. I will read Sire's definition. He says, a worldview or a vision for life is a framework or set of fundamental beliefs through which we view the world and our calling and future in it. This vision need not be fully articulated. It may be so internalized that it goes largely unquestioned. It may not be explicitly developed in a systematic conception of life. It may not be theoretically deepened into philosophy. It may not even be codified into creedal form. It may be greatly refined through cultural historical development. Nevertheless, this vision is a channel for the ultimate beliefs which give direction and meaning to life. It is the integrative and interpretive framework by which order and disorder are judged. It is the standard by which reality is managed and pursued. And so he also offers a different one. And actually, I read the wrong one. That's by James Sire in his book, Worldviews. Sire says a worldview is a commitment, a fundamental orientation of the heart that can be expressed as a story in a set of presuppositions, assumptions which may be true, partially true, or entirely false, that we hold consciously or unconsciously, consistently or inconsistently, about the basic constitution of reality, and that provides the foundation on which we live and move and have our being. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I really appreciate about Sire's, sorry, I read the wrong one at first, but about Sire's is that he acknowledges that some pieces of our worldview just happen. Like we just participate in life from a way of thinking about the world that we don't even question. It's just in our set of presuppositions. Some things may be completely false, but we still participate with them as if they may be true or, part of the way that we see the world and interact with the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So go ahead.
I was going to say the only part that I is sort of like a little downside. I give a little thumbs down there for me on Sire's definition is he talks about the orientation of the heart. And I think I only don't like that because I think it could be misleading to people that were in a world conditioned to follow your heart, right? Follow this internal sense of heart. But I think and I don't think what he writes undermines his overall definition. There's a holistic view of Christians, but it's both our heart, our passions, our desires, our mind, our thoughts, our spiritual self, the soulish self, but also our physical bodies. There's a holistic sense that's inherent to the Christian worldview that's built into the creation story, that it's not just one part of us or another. I don't think that's his intent to say it. I only don't like it because I think it could maybe mislead some people to thinking that it's only a heart issue, not a whole person, mind, body, soul issue. That's sort of maybe picking at the weeds a little bit because, like I said, I don't think that's his intent to say that. And I think if you read carefully, you wouldn't get that. But somebody reading it, not familiar with the Christian worldview, might think he's only caring about the follow your heart kind of mentality.
That's good. I didn't think about that. And so you would say that because we can also love God with our mind, or that our circumstances impact us, that these things are also pertinent to understanding worldview and what frames our worldview, not just our orientation of heart.
Yeah, it's an alignment of our passions, of our mind, of our thinking. It's an alignment of our actions. All of those things have to be aligned for that intentional framework that he is talking about, right? Connectivity of all of those things.
Okay. So let's jump into, because we're almost halfway through already.
Oh my goodness.
Let's jump into Christian theism.
Yeah.
And I literally, you guys, I have my notes, partly because I'm also an apologetics 1, and I need to be using this live stream multi-purposefully. So I have to, take some notes from my class too. So in under Christian theism, which is the Christian worldview, let's jump in there. And first of all, I just want to know, what do you think makes the Christian worldview distinct above other worldviews?
Yeah, that's a great question. So if the videos you guys sent out, there's one on what are my worldview options, and I kind of give like a family tree of how these worldviews are interconnected. And this is the only part I think in Sire's work that maybe, if for those unfamiliar with this, can't see how they're all interrelated. So I think broadly speaking, we say there's two categories. There's the naturalistic family of worldviews, and then there's the sort of supernatural world family of worldviews. And I'm not a fan of the natural versus supernatural distinction, but It's the best language we have. So here we are. In other words, is nature all there is, or is there something possibly outside nature, a god or gods, anything like that, fall into the supernatural category? And so, there's naturalism, which we get atheism, that sort of idea. Then there's supernaturalism. Underneath that, we have impersonal and personal kinds. So impersonal would be like pantheism. Personal kinds, we end up in a variety of theistic views like polytheism and monotheism. And so underneath that monotheism, we have Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. And so one of those things that sets us apart from most worldviews is this idea that something exists outside of nature, that something is a personal, caring, loving God who's engaged with our life. So it's the personality and personhood of God. And there's only one God, that monotheistic side. And so right there, we've narrowed Christianity down to only being in that realm with other monotheistic, which are Judaism and Islam. And then we can look at the distinctions between those two is inside worldviews broadly. But so those things itself, just the idea of the supernatural, that something exists, there's a creator for the created world, that's a personal intimacy connected, and it's monotheistic one. Those are some of the key out of the jump that set us apart from other worldviews.
Okay, so when we think of Christian worldview, we are thinking of a worldview that is monotheistic, and not only is it monotheistic, but it is personal. So if we as Christians believe in a God who is personal, or personable, and there is only one God, and out of that worldview family or subset, because we would say that in the worldview families, you're either naturalistic or supernaturalistic. And in the supernaturalistic category, you have those who are impersonal gods. So looking at the impersonal versus the personal, which would be like the God of Judaism, that is a personal God when we look in the Old Testament, or Christianity, or Islam.
Islam, yeah.
Do I have it?
Correct.
Okay. All right.
Correct. You're tracking exactly where we're at.
Because I'm taking notes, don't
Yeah.
So then when we think about this idea of the three, we have Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. When we're thinking about our worldview and what sets us apart, can you help us thread through maybe a few of these worldview questions as to how are we distinctly different in our thought of prime reality than maybe the person who has put their faith in Allah through Muslim or Islam.
So this is where Judaism and Christianity would set themselves as distinct from Islam. For Allah, within that framework, he's a person God, but he's not really personal or relational in the same way that he is within Christianity. The idea, the concept of a loving God or a God who loves isn't even part of the Quranic sort of message, a God who loves. It's a far more judicial relationship of judgment, of anger, and earning salvation in that long-term sense of how do I achieve this eternal life with God. For Christians and Jews alike, though, our origin begins in Genesis. And I do believe that the thing that sets Christianity apart from, and Judaism in this case, from anything else is the Genesis story of creation. Only in this do we get this sense of one God who creates ex nihilo, out of nothing. So we get in Genesis 1, verse 1, in the beginning, God created. There's nothing except God, and God brings everything into existence. And then we see that this idea of the earth, this creation was, the phrase in the Hebrew is tohu abohu. It was formless and void, or formless without shape and empty. And this takes to the rest of the passage in chapter 1, where we see God not just creates ex nihilo, out of nothing, but a God who creates ex materia. He takes what he speaks into existence, and he gives it shape, he gives it form, he gives it function. So he separates the dark and the light. He separates waters above and below. He separates the land from the sea. That's this tohu part. He takes that which is shapeless and gives it shape and form. And then he fills it like an artisan. Think of like a potter who takes some clay, right? He takes the existing stuff. So God speaks the material world into existence. Now he's like the potter shaping that into a vase, but then he's got to fill it with something, right? What is the purpose of that vase? And we see God filling, especially days 4, 5, and 6. He takes and fills the stars, puts the stars and fills the space, right? The sun and the moon. He fills the waters above and the waters below with birds and then sea creatures. And then on day 6, he fills the land with animals and then humans and creates this garden. So we get this sense that God is both powerful, that he's all powerful because he brings everything into being out of the power of his word, but he's also intimately involved as an artisan, as a craftsman, as a God who cares. He takes intimate concern for his creation through shaping and fashioning and filling. And I love those two parts of who Yahweh is in this creation story, because we find that nowhere else. We find a God who is so powerful yet loves and cares for the creation, this material reality that he created.
Wow, that's good. Like that'll preach right there.
Yeah.
But so much of what you're hitting on is really about our prime reality.
Mm-hmm.
What is really real, and where does knowledge start? And when I think of some of Sire's words in introducing question 1, which is prime reality, he says prime reality is the infinite personal God revealed in the Holy Scriptures. This God is triune, transcendent, and immanent, omniscient, sovereign, and good. And I think we could add to that he is omnipotent as well. All that we see in Genesis reveals so much of God's character and just who he is. And I think then, as the rest of Scripture unfolds, we can continuously see his character again and again and again. But we see who God is in Genesis with this creator and beauty and like his love, the idea of him as a relatable God and wanting relationship with his creation and things like that.
Yeah, I summarize it this way for those 4 sort of qualities of God. The nature of God is absolute, he's holy, he's personal, and he's relational. The relational side speaks to the Trinitarian, the eternal Trinity that is Father, Son, and Spirit. The personhood of God, just that he has identity, right? We don't get to make up our own version. Just like I can't describe Monique as a 6'7", blonde-haired, blue-eyed Norwegian woman, right? Because Monique isn't that. You are real, right? I don't get to make you up, right? I don't get to make up things about you because you're real. And so God's the same way. So that he's personal in that sense. He's holy, which, the Bible reveals that he's a holy God who makes a holy world. It is good. It is very good. And he creates a 7th day and blesses it so that we can continue the holy works of God in our life. But then the absolute nature of God, and I boil that down to the 5 omnis of God. We all know the omniscient, he's all-knowing, omnipresent, he's all-present, omnipotent, all-powerful. But I think the 2 that are often missing are that God is omnibenevolent, that he is all-loving, he's all-kind. I think that we see that in the creation story, that every act he chooses is for our benefit and our blessing, even the ones that don't feel great. So that omnibenevolence of God, and then also that God is omnisapient. That's the one I think is always missing, that God is all wise. Because it's not enough that God knows everything. God has to be wise enough to take that knowledge and use it for my good, right? God can claim to be good. God can claim to be wise and powerful, but if he's not wise, he doesn't know how to use that power. He doesn't know how to use that knowledge for the blessing of me and for the blessing of all of humanity. So those are the 5 omnis that I think are really critical to that absolute nature of God.
I got to take a lot of notes.
Yeah.
But you're also hitting on worldview questions 2 and 3 in regards to who God is or what is real and true, and how are we answering what the Christian faith believes and puts forward and how we live that out. And so in Worldview Question 2, external reality, Sire says, external reality is the cosmos God created ex nihilo to operate with a uniformity of cause and effect in an open system. So when we're saying that God created ex nihilo, he created out of nothing. He spoke the world into being. So he, in his power and wisdom and, benevolence and all of that, created a world that would operate in a system that it would have order.
It's really important. We miss a part of why that's so important. Unless we compare that Hebrew worldview to every other polytheistic religion that surrounded them. They were the only monotheistic religion in the entire ancient Near East. Everybody else was polytheistic. And there's a story of creation called Enuma Elish, where this god Marduk, he's in battle, locked in battle with this goddess Tiamat, and he eventually slaughters her in battle. He comes and stands over what's called her dead lump and mass of body. He rips her body in half, stretches half of her body to create the skies, half of her body is sort of the land below. And so this is the origin. So it's an ex materia origin, right? The gods creating out of the bodies, the flesh of the eternal existence of these other gods, right? But this has an important implication for the rest of Sire's questions, especially when we get to the idea of purpose and ethics, and we miss this. So for the people of the ancient world, because the gods lived and died through this cyclical thing, the gods were born, the gods lived, they died. Everything in life was capricious. That's why these gods could be sort of some days loving and some days evil. They didn't care for humanity in a particular way. Humanity's origins are just as sort of at the whim of the gods as much as how many gods could defeat other gods. It's all chaos, right? But if we're two groups of people and I worship Marduk and you worship Tiamat, well, if my God's bigger than your God, my God could punch your God in the nose, then I have the right to kill your people, to capture your people, to enslave your people. See, if that's the nature of the ultimate reality, then I'm living this cycle of birth and death and just trying to get what I can in between, right? Because that's all that I'm mirroring is the life of the ultimate reality that is the gods. But for Christianity, because there is a beginning, there's an arrow of time. There's a beginning to my life, but there's also an ultimate purpose for my life. And if I know that there's a purpose, then everything I go through is not just this cyclical repeating, wash, rinse, repeat. Oh, I'm going through trials. I'm going through suffering. There's a purpose at the end of all those things. And there's also a compassion that I'm driven to care for the people in my life, because all of those people are created B'Tselem Elohim, in the image of God. And that means they all have a sacred worth, the same that has been given intrinsically by this God who's powerfully created, and this artisan who has shaped me and shaped my life and filled me with a spirit to live in a way that's purposeful and holy. So there's a very dramatic implication for the way we live our daily choices based on this idea of ex nihilo creation, and then the ex materia shaping of that creation with compassion and love that reflect that nature of our God, that absolute nature of our God, that we just can't look aside that. It just doesn't end at creation. Like, oh, cool, he made everything, right? There's so much, it literally should shape every choice I make every day.
Wow. Sire puts it this way. He says, the universe is orderly and God does not present us with confusion, but with clarity. The nature of God's universe and God's character are thus closely related. This world is as it is, at least in part, because God is who he is. Mm-hmm. And I think that's exactly what you're saying. Like, we can't overstep the reality that our world is set up and runs how it runs and is how it is because God is who he is. Mm-hmm. And absolutely. In understanding that should shape everything that we do. All right, let's keep going. He says in Worldview Questions 3, in relation to human beings are created in the image of God, which you just mentioned, and thus possess personality, self-transcendence, intelligence, morality, gregariousness, and creativity. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I think is going to be interesting as we dive deeper into this book is how that differs in different worldviews. not only does the idea of God differ, but the idea of what a human being, a human person is, differs, and our purpose. And do we actually have purpose? So what is a human being? When we think of what it means to be human, when you have a different worldview that might say, well, it doesn't really mean anything to be human, or to be human is to just simply be disposable and things like that, you can see where other worldviews could potentially support abortion or support massacring people, or you know what I mean? Like if the idea that a human person doesn't really mean much, why would I care if I killed them?
Yeah. It's not just that being a human person doesn't mean much. For some worldviews, especially the naturalism, human means nothing. There is no definition of what it means to be a human person. There is no stable, transcendent reality that makes us us. So I boil it down to this. The Christian worldview says there's two kinds of value within humanity. There's intrinsic value and instrumental value. So being made B'Tselem Elohim, that is Imago Dei, the image of God, entails with it intrinsic value. This is where God breathes into us the breath of life. We become sacred beings, both physically and immaterially, both soulish and physical, right? There's two parts to who we are, but it's one whole. Both matter. Both are given a transcendent and essential quality that cannot be diminished, even if I make poor choices. So if I'm abused, if I'm, sexually assaulted, or if somebody imprisons me, nobody can take away, not even me, I can't take away my own intrinsic value, because that has been given by the God who created ex nihilo, out of nothing, and breathed into us as humans the breath of life. But then there's instrumental value. God says, be fruitful and multiply, have dominion over the earth. We're giving a purpose. And so it's this idea that God creates Adam and Eve, he puts them in a garden, and he says, be fruitful, have babies, then do the holy works that I've created for you. So we take a good world, and I say it in my class, so take a good world, make it gooder, right? It's not a perfect world. It's a world that God intended for us to be sort of co-creators with him. Not in the divine sense, but in the sense that we reflect the creative power and the love of our Creator with the things that we are to create, that we are to accomplish. So we take a good world, we make it gooder towards this ultimate end of God's promised world, from a garden temple to a global temple. And this is the trajectory of our lives, and the value we have, both intrinsically and instrumentally, are critical to human flourishing, are critical to the way we experience joy and peace and contentment of life. Because I can instrumentally choose to do poor things. I can be out of God's purpose for my life when I take certain actions. We call those sin, right? Out of God's holy nature. Acts that refuse to worship God, put him as our highest value. So those two pieces of humanity, intrinsic and instrumental, really then become the key that are different with the Christian worldview, because for naturalism, there is no intrinsic, there's only instrumental. And so when we're left with instrumental, is your value to me is only what have you done for me lately, right? What have you done for me lately? So that's right. So
little Paula Abdul.
Little Paula.
Okay.
So, right? So that's all we're left with naturalism. And that's sort of when we get to identity. When we talk about human identity, there's 5 facets I talk about. I won't do it right now because that's too many words and too much confusion. But naturalism will deny the 2 aspects, the transcendent and essential parts of identity. All we're left with, and this will get to the issue of race when we talked about that part, because all that's left are the sort of cultural, the relational, and the sort of physical components that make my identity. And all of those things change over time. And that means there's nothing about me that's significant in the long-term sense.
Yes. Alicia O'Connell just said that was Janet Jackson and not Paul Abdul. I was thinking straight up, now tell me, do you really want to love me forever?
Or you just having fun.
Yes.
Song night on here.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, goodness. Okay. So
it's a dance party.
This hour is going quick. The whole idea of intrinsic versus instrumental value is so important because when you think about intrinsic value, I have intrinsic value. It's something that you, me, whoever, every human, we can't create our intrinsic value. That's something that we obtain, are blessed with. It comes because of God and being created in his image. But when we think about instrumental value and the fact that I can also be valuable because of what I create, because of what I give, because of my purpose in the earth and the things that I do, that is also hugely important. And one of the immediate things that came to my mind was what happens to the person when we take away the idea of work, or when we separate work from the human person. And now, like, for, let's say, the person who's not in a belief system or a reality about their intrinsic identity. And so that's not really something that, they understand. But now we might have a worldview that says, well, work really isn't that important. Like, for the Christian, work is a part of the created order. But when we take away the idea of work, and I know this might be a little bit off topic, but I feel like in understanding why worldviews
right on.
matter,
I think you're exactly right.
Like, when we separate work from the human person, what do we then do with that instrumental value?
Work is not a punishment after the fall. Work did not come into the world because of the fall. Work was always there, present in the idyllic world created, and we were charged with making that idyllic good world gooder through our work, right? So it was always the thing that came
Adam
in.
had a job before he had Eve.
Exactly. Yeah, that's right, he did. And she made that work harder, but better. She's the companion, made it better. Don't misunderstand me, all right, she made it better. So anyways, so they're working cooperatively together. So work was not a punishment. Work was the blessing. That was the blessing of the seventh day. We become co-creators, co-inventors with our God, shapers, molders of our future and life and of the world itself. Sort of like terraforming the world. The borders of the garden were supposed to expand as people grew. And think of that like sci-fi idea of terraforming a globe. That's what we were going to be charged with doing. Not harming the world or the environment, but bringing it into having dominion over it, right? That's a beautiful picture of what work should be. And you're absolutely right. When we think of work only as a punishment of the gods, which is what it was for the people outside of Israel, they were the slave to the gods, and they were given the work that was beneath the gods, right? That they were not willing to do. And so, you capture other people, you enslave them so they can do the work that's beneath your people because you worship the better God than they have. But that's not how it was supposed to be. There was monotheistic, one God, and that meant our affections, our desires, our passions were not divided towards God or towards one another because we were all unified in our worship and in our work for that one great end that suited all of humanity. So this idea is so important. And when we take away the beauty of work and when we take away work in general, right? Oh, we're going to pay you not to work. We're going to give you welfare, right? This is terrible because what we're doing is we're diminishing the instrumental value that people were designed for. And when we don't see instrumental value and we deny that there's a God who gave us intrinsic value, what's left? Nothing. Hopelessness, nihilism that we'll look at, right? So we don't want to end up there. So if you have a worldview that denies there's a God, you deny intrinsic value. And if your worldview says, well, hey, if you can't work, I'm just going to give it to you, then we deny their instrumental value. We make useless people who feel useless and look in the mirror and see, what good am I? And only the Christian worldview has an answer to that question of, well, what good am I?
Man, that's so good. Woo-wee. Only the Christian worldview has an answer to the question, what good am I? Yes. Okay. We have to wrap. We got to start the wrap. My goodness gracious.
Wrap it up.
Okay. I know it's time to wrap it up. How would you answer the question? Let me see. I wrote it down because I wanted to make sure I actually asked it. How does this worldview impact the conversation of race?
Yeah. So let's look at race really quickly here. And I think we'll see we can create more contrast as each worldview comes up, right? So hang in there the next 5 weeks. I think we'll create a bigger and bigger contrast. So race, we know, is a social construct, right? It's something that culture has created. It's a way of dividing us and segregating us into kinds of people, right? So now race can be a part of it is certainly a part of our identity. So society shapes identity. That's okay. Relationships shape identity. That's okay. Our compositional identity, the parts that make up the whole, am I right-handed, left-handed, am I dark-skinned, light-skinned, those are all okay as parts of shaping who we are. Not necessarily, not inherently or intrinsically bad. But what for the Christian we know is we have both a transcendent and an essential part of our identity that is unchangeable, that does not shift with culture. So for Christians, that transcendent and essential parts of identity tied to our B'Tselem Elohim, that were made in the image of God, that sense of intrinsic value, those stabilize everything that shifts with culture. So some cultures say, hey, if you are this race, you are bad. If you are this race, you are good. That Darwinian naturalism created a hierarchy of, well, it traded and at least it created, the Western Enlightenment created this sort of racial categories. But Darwin certainly traded that and gave a scientific justification for why some races are superior and other races are inferior. We can see that in the 70s, it got flipped on its head with certain sort of black liberation moments where the black race was said it's at the top of the hierarchy and the white race is at the bottom of the hierarchy. Well, if you have no transcendent and essential because there is no God, all you're left with are the relational, the cultural, and the compositional parts of us. So, hey, if your composition is you are light-skinned, you're not valuable. If the culture says you're valuable, you're valuable. If the culture says you're throwaway trash, you're throwaway trash. The culture says instrumentally, what can you do for me? Well, nothing because you are missing an arm or you're missing a leg or you're handicapped in some way. Then compositionally, you're defective, you have no instrumental value, get rid of you, euthanize you, abort you, do whatever needs to be done. So race is tied to that cultural and relational, but also that compositional part of identity that has value. But if it becomes the sole basis of value, then it becomes it just goes with the ebbs and flows of culture. We need people to tell us, no, I am value. We have no inherent dignity or value. It's just what the culture says. So we're stuck without the Christian worldview. The concept of race is always going to lead to division, hatred, bigotry, and anger. Only within the Christian worldview can that concept of race have any sort of stabilized meaning. I think it should be eliminated completely because I think it's been a net negative. I don't think it has any value historically, and I don't think it's redeemable at all. But at least it could be stabilized with a Christian worldview, best case scenario, because there's something transcendent and essential to appeal to that's part of our core identity.
Yes. And I love that about Christianity, that I don't have to associate or find value in my skin color. Like, am I fearfully and wonderfully made, intentionally made? Yes. But that's not my core identity. That's not like the first thing about me. It's the fact that I am a child of God and that God is the creator of all and who he is and all of that. And so when we think about Christianity and the idea of race, I do think getting rid of this concept of race would be super helpful and tying it back to our ethnicity. But when we think about all of the current conversations happening in the world regarding race, Christianity is the one religion and framework, worldview that brings us back to something outside of ourselves and says that you were intentionally, fearfully, and wonderfully made, and that you have intrinsic value regardless of what your skin color is.
Yeah. Hey, I just saw a comment here from Michelle, my belle. Said, I wish I was this smart, but but she says she's not. So I believe the Beatles had a song for you. Michelle, my belle, sont les monkeys bon très bien, sont très bien. God loves you, God loves you, God loves you. That's the song. They didn't say the God loves you part. But sorry, I'm just singing today. But you got me wound up. God loves us, right? It doesn't matter if we're different instrumentally, if we're smarter, whatever, we're handicapped. God loves us, and that's the value. And then we create instrumental work based on God's love for us. So I just want to throw that out.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for joining us. Joe, thank you. I'll see you over the course of the next 6 weeks or 5 weeks from here on out. So get the book, and we will see you next week. Bye.
That's it for part 1 of our 6-part series on Sire's book, The Universe Next Door. You can find out more information on the book and about Monique and her ministry with the Center for Biblical Unity in the show notes. And I hope you'll come back next week and join us for the next episode where we raise the roof on deism and naturalism. In the meantime, don't forget to follow and rate the show on your favorite podcasting service. And if you want to participate with me in a subscribers-only question and answer, you can sign up through my website, morethancake.org.